Hello everyone, this is Sam Spade with another tutorial in the Coding Fundamentals in GML 2.3 series. In this tutorial, we're going to talk about some miscellaneous function stuff that I didn't really get a chance to cover in the other tutorials on functions and methods, but think that they're important enough to be discussed. So these are the 5 things we're going to talk about. Again, they are sort of odds and ends, but let's just go through them one by one. First up, we have the default return value in 2.3 is now undefined. So if you write a function that doesn't use the word return, GameMaker still returns something, and that value is undefined. But probably won't matter for most people, because generally, if you're not returning something from a script, you probably shouldn't be assigning the return value to a variable. And we can see this very quickly in GameMaker. So if I switch over here, we have a function. And if we were to uncomment this code right here, it would return the number 5. So if we were to say show message my function, this would return 5 and we would see the number 5. However, if we comment the return value out, so now this function doesn't return anything, we can still call it and we should get undefined. Let's do that quickly. So here you go. You can see that we got undefined because we didn't specify any return value. Next up, we have named arguments. And this one I think is actually quite cool. You don't need to use all of the named arguments in a function. So when you create a function, whether that is through a script function or a method variable, you can use named arguments in 2.3, but you don't need to pass in all of those arguments. Any unused arguments get the value undefined. And it is important to remember that you can't specify, at least as far as I know, which arguments are going to be unused. So let's say you create a function with 3 arguments and you only pass in 2. The third argument is always going to be undefined. But this is overall a really nice feature and has a couple interesting uses. You can always check for undefined arguments with the built-in function is undefined. You could also check whether the variable equals undefined, but is undefined is a little bit safer. And again, we can switch over to GameMaker to see a quick example of this. So if we come over here, we can have this function set greeting. It's a function and it can take an argument. However, if we don't pass in an argument, then greeting will be undefined, and we can check that with is undefined. And so this is actually one use for not passing in all the arguments. We can use the ternary operator here to assign a default value to greeting if no greeting is passed in. So if we call set greeting and we don't pass in a value, greeting will be undefined. It will use the default value hello world, and greeting will be set to hello world. And let's just see that quickly. Okay, so we've stopped on this line. We're going to step into the function. And here we go. Greeting is undefined. You can see the greeting is undefined right here because we didn't pass anything in. And so the variable greeting will be set to hello. And indeed, we can see that over here, greeting equals hello world. Next up, we have the argument array. Not needing to pass in all the arguments that you've named can be very helpful, but there's a flip side to that problem, which is sometimes you might want to pass in an amount of arguments that you don't know how many arguments you're going to pass in. For example, maybe you want to create a generic function that will add a number of arguments to the middle of an array, but you want it to work whether you pass it in 1 argument or 10. For something like that, you can use the argument array. It's an alternative to name arguments, and it is an array, so you reference it like you would an array, and the built-in variable argument count gives you the length of this array. Once more, let's switch over to GameMaker to see a quick example. So here we go, we have the function array add to end. So obviously for something like this, we don't have a way to put in named arguments. So we can just leave the name arguments blank and use the argument array. The first argument is going to be the array itself that we're going to add to, and then every value after that is going to be what we put into the array. And again, we can run this quickly in the debugger and just see it in action. So here we are, we're going to initialize a blank array, and then we're going to add all these values into that array using this function. We can come in and we can start adding values to the array. And when we are done, we can see over here that we have our array and all of these values have been added to it. And one last thing actually that I think is worth pointing out is that you can mix named arguments and the argument array. So you could make array one of the named arguments, and then we can remove this line. So again, this is a named argument. It will get used here, and we can still use the argument array for the rest of the function. And I think that this is a pretty nice quality of life feature. JSDoc script comments are still a thing as well in 2.3. These help you document your scripts and your functions and gives you autocomplete when you are using them inside of GameMaker. Some of these features are set in the preferences for GameMaker Studio, but you can use @function, where you use the function name and then the names of any arguments. You can define the parameters, and this is one of the preferences you can change in GameMaker. It's a little bit hard to see, but there's actually 3 different parts here. You have this first part, which is the type of the argument that will be passed in. This second part, which is the name of the argument or the parameter, and this third part, which is sort of a brief description about what the argument is supposed to do. And it's these spaces right here, this space and this space, that determine which parts are in. So whenever you add a space, that's going to separate these parts. And each of these parts can be toggled on or off in the preferences window. Let's switch back over to GameMaker one more time and see some examples. So here we are. You might have already noticed that I've added them to all of these functions that we've been using. So we have the @ function and then my function. And one important note with this is that adding these JSDoc script comments to variable methods will in fact give you that text highlighting. I personally don't like this. I think it's too confusing because now this is going to appear like a globally accessible script function, but it won't be. So I normally don't use these for method variables, but I would for any script function declared in a script asset. So for example, the struct alarms does this. We have the alarm struct. We have our two parameters, the type of the value that should be passed in, the name of the value that should be passed in, and the description of the value that should be passed in, and then a description of what this function does. One other thing to note is that argument count can be used independent of the argument array. You see I'm doing it here to count how many arguments are being passed into this function. And this gives us autocomplete because if we come over here, we can use this alarm struct right here. And if I click on it, you can see now that even though I've written this function, alarm struct actually tells me all of this information down here. It tells me that the first argument should be a number and the second argument should be a function. And as I mentioned, you can set what is displayed here by going to Preferences and then going to Languages and then GML. And now you can choose to display whether or not you want the argument types and descriptions to show up. I generally only use type, that's this part right here, but I could add in descriptions. And now, if we came down here, we would see that this description is added as well. Real default start time, a number greater than 0. Function, what the alarm will do when it goes off. I don't use this personally because it gets too verbose very fast. You won't be able to see all of the arguments on the screen and what they're supposed to do, but it's good to know that it's there. Last and probably least, we have a couple functions that exist specifically for script functions. These will not work for method variables, but you have script exist. This tells you whether or not a script function exists. Script get name. You give this built-in function the resource ID for your script function, and it will give you the string version of that resource ID. This one can be useful in certain circumstances, and it's important to note that it works on script functions, not script assets. And then finally, script execute. This one doesn't have a lot of uses now. It's primarily there for compatibility purposes and a couple networking things, but it allows you to pass in a script resource ID as the first argument, and then any arguments for that script resource as additional arguments, and then it will execute that script. Now I'm not going to switch over to GameMaker for these because they're built-in functions that have examples already in the manual. So in summary, the default return value is undefined. Unused named arguments are set to undefined. The argument array is useful when you will be passing in an unknown amount of variables to a function, and you can document and get autocomplete for your functions with JSDoc script comments. These links are below, as well as links to the slides themselves and the source code, and that's it. Thanks for watching.